Welcome to part 1 of our hedgehog feeding series. What do all of these things here have in common? These are all things that can be fed to hedgehogs. Just some of the many things you can feed to these little critters. Since this is just part 1, I will specifically be talking about the kibble aspect of the diet. There is always a lot of debate on whether it is better to feed animals what they naturally eat in the wild or what we create for them ourselves. Since most of us don't have the time or the money to feed them exactly what they eat in the wild, a lot of us settle for these processed animal foods. If you're like me and you want to feed your hedgehog a dry kibble as the main component of its diet, I recommend going with cat food, and I'll go into why here in a little bit. I'll spare you all the really intense science, but basically the reason cat food is a better option than dog food is because the amino acid content in the proteins in the cat food line up better with the hedgehog diet than the dogs. They do make a hedgehog food specifically on the market, but once you see the numbers that are required in these diets, when you look at the hedgehog foods, you'll notice that they don't match up. A veterinarian or somebody else who claims to be knowledgeable may have told you that's what you should feed your hedgehog, but that is not the case. These companies have not actually lined up the nutrient values very well with what they put in the food. I believe they're just taking advantage of a market where there isn't a lot of items to be bought right now. So let's get right down to it here. If you don't want to feed your hedgehog the natural diet of pure insects, as most of us don't, you'll want to feed kibble. Now I hope you don't do what I did when I first got my hedgehog, and I didn't know better. I had been told numbers to look for on the guaranteed analysis here, and I only looked at the percentages. I did not look at the most important part, the ingredients. So, in the first bag of food I bought, the numbers all lined up here quite well, which I'll go over in a minute what those are. What I failed to do was notice the first 3 ingredients on this list. My first ingredient was corn, and what actually happened to my little guy is his skin started to turn yellow, which is a sign of an unhealthy liver. So that's when I had to reevaluate what I was doing. Now, as you can see here, I use 2 foods. I mix them together, and I'll explain why in a second. Rule of thumb is fat needs to be as low as possible and fiber needs to be as high as possible. What really drew me to this bag was, if you notice, the crude fiber percent here is 5.4. It needs to be at least 4%. There's a lot of fiber in insects, and sometimes these foods, which are made for cats and dogs, do not have enough fiber for hedgehogs. The reason this food works so well is because it's for indoor cats. Why does that line up? Indoor cats typically aren't as active, and because of that, the crude fat is a lot less. I wouldn't go any higher than 10%. It's really hard to keep weight off hedgehogs, and you don't want to make it any more difficult by feeding them a high-fat food. Fiber is important for indoor cats too, as they don't move around as much and they need more help moving the food through their system. So oftentimes, indoor cat foods will line up best with the contents of the food. Protein needs to be high, but not too high. Protein digestion is really complicated, and I won't go into that. But anything higher than 40 may be a little excessive. Anything lower than 32% might not be quite enough. But as you can see here, the first ingredient listed is chicken byproduct meal. That's a meat protein source. That's a good quality protein. The second ingredient is less than desirable at corn gluten meal, which is why I added the second food, and I'll go into that in a minute. Here you'll see the ingredients and the analysis of the second food I was talking about. As you notice here, the crude protein is a little lower than my other food, which is not a big deal. That's why I mix them together. Crude fat is the reason I don't just straight feed this food by itself. You notice that the minimum analysis is at 12.5%. That's pretty high, and with my hedgehog having a little bit of a hard time not getting fat, I need to try to limit that as much as possible. Crude fiber in this food is very good at 6%. It's hard to find a whole lot higher than that in cat food, and that's a wonderful thing. But the real kicker here is if you look at the first 3 ingredients, the first 2 ingredients our protein source, chicken and chicken meal. That's very important. The third is brown rice, which is still a starch. And being a starch, it's not all that nutritionally beneficial to the hedgehogs, but for some reason, it's a lot easier for them to pass through their system than corn, and doesn't make them yellow with all the carotene. So, that's a bonus. One other thing I will touch on real quickly is that it's actually incredibly beneficial to these animals to rotate the kibble. So what I try to do is I'll feed a little bit more of this one, maybe this week, in comparison to this one, and then switch it up next week. When I run out of one of these bags, I go and try to find a different brand with different contents, but a similar percentage of each nutrient. It's really good for the microbes in their intestine, and it makes them more flexible and will allow them to eat things of a wider variety without getting sick. So in summary, just remember, try to emulate the nutrient content of insects as much as possible. What does that mean? A high level of protein, high amounts of fiber, at least 4% in the food, and as low as possible levels of fat. And last but most important, make sure the first few ingredients on the list are a good protein quality. Avoid corn and avoid starch if at all possible.